Okay, welcome everyone to this SPHN webinar series. I would like to introduce today's speaker, which is Alexandra Scherrer and Michael Koller. So Alexandra Scherrer studied biology and epidemiology on the University of Basel. Then she did her PhD at the University Hospital in Zurich, focusing on research on epidemiology and HIV, before she was actually leading the data center of the Swiss HIV cohorts. And then actually now she joined the University Hospital of Basel to work on the IDEAL project, which we will hear about today. And our second speaker of today is Michael Koller. He's the head of the data center of the Swiss transplantation cohort and one of the investigators of the STCS. He studied medicine at the University Hospital of Zurich, and he did a Master of Science in Clinical Epidemiology, and then he did his habilitation at the University of Basel. And Michael is the main investigator of the IDEAL project. The IDEAL project is a project funded by Biomed IT, and it's actually providing a platform to link identifiers between patient-centered research and healthcare providers. And with that, I would like to give the word to Michael, who will tell us more about the project. Thanks a lot for joining this webinar today.
Thank you very much, Sabine, for the kind introduction. And I will continue with an introduction to the IDEAL project. And we'll quickly start to tell you and to explain a little bit how it came about, the IDEAL project. So in 2018, there was the second SPHN infrastructure project call. And in this context, several cohorts met for a networking meeting and to explore different options and ideas for collaboration. Several topics were on the table, and one topic that was rated as quite important was the large-scale sharing of routine data from the hospitals with cohorts, and this was perceived as actually a nearly insurmountable obstacle to overcome. And of course, I think we all know that the key issues behind this difficulty is that there is a lack of data interoperability. And the second really important issue is that there is the inexistence of a national unique subject identifier that can be used for research in Switzerland, or I would say human research, and that can be used to perform record linkage across different data sources. Most of you may know that the HIV, the AHV number, or the Swiss Social Security number, that there is no legal basis to use it. It would actually be a nearly perfect identifier in Switzerland, but there is no legal basis to use it for human research unless the patient gives explicit consent for its use. So this is the limitation. We cannot use the Swiss Social Security number, and there is no other national identifier. So with the cohorts, we thought about the possible solution. And in this context, we had the idea to build, we discussed the solution of what we called a keyring or a linkage interface that will map the different subject identifiers from an individual, for example, from the hospital and from different sources, like, for example, a cohort or a clinical trial, into one tool. And we combine this, and in this way we produce the keyring and we combine it with the subject identifiable data. This was the basic idea, and we securely store it within the hospital environment, which is the data controller. And we all agreed, actually all the cohorts and all the institutes that were interested in this topic, that a national approach is needed. And we also saw it as some kind of advantage that we can introduce some interoperability into the management of person identifiable data of patients who also who are participants in research studies. And in this way, the IDEAL consortium was built. Then we submitted the IDEAL as an infrastructure development project during the 2018 SPHN call, and we got the following notification. So basically there was interest in this topic and in the IDEAL project, but it was mentioned that the IDEAL will fall within the mission of Biomed IT and the SIB, and it will be transferred to the SIB, and the funding decision will be taken very soon. So then we actually continued with the project, and we were all quite hopeful that this will end in a project that we can really do. And feedback that we got from the Biomed IT board was that we had to actually expand the proposal. So we need to specify the software requirements, the architecture. We had to set up a better time schedule and revise the budget. And it was required that we get Unimed Swiss approval. That means this is the approval of the hospital directors of all the university hospitals. And then the third point to do was that we had to review and approve the approach of the IDEAL project by the Basel Stadtkantonal Data Protection Officer and by the legal department of the University Hospital of Basel. And finally, in October 2020, the IDEAL project was funded by the Biomed IT board and by the SIB, and we could start. And I am happy now to present you the implementation team. So the project is led by Alexandra Scherrer. She's now a member of the STCS data center, and she's the leader of the project. Then the lead developer of the IDEAL project is Yijing. She is working in the group of Thierry Sendstock at Cohort in Basel. Then we have in the team Fabian Franzek. He's a data warehouse expert, and he works in the group of Bram Stiltjes at the University Hospital in Basel. And with this, I would like to hand over to Alexandra to continue with the more detailed presentation.
Thank you, Michael, for the nice introduction. So I'm happy to present you the details of the IDEAL project. As Michael said, IDEAL is funded by the Swiss Institute of Bioinformatics by the Biomed IT group, and it is also endorsed by Unimed Swiss. The IDEAL is a consortium of different cohorts and institutes. As you see, the transplant cohort is involved, the CTUs are involved, the HIV cohort study, the rheumatic disease registry, the lupus cohort, and also experts from medical registry and data linkage, as well as the data coordination lab from the Inselspital. So with this group, we really cover broad expertise in health research and also informatics. So what is the IDEAL project about? IDEAL wants to provide an IT infrastructure to easier combine routine clinical data and research data. And this is done on an individual participant level, a so-called record linkage or ID mapping. So why did we come up with this project? So it is also a legal challenge when you do a research study involving health-related data. So you have to pseudonymize your data. It is not allowed to have the identifiable data on a clinical data set or biological sample used for research. So in fact, you need two documents. In one document, you have your study data with de-identified patient data, and on another file, you have identifiable patient data. So every study done with health-related data has somewhere a linkage database to identify and de-identify and re-identify the participants. So the responsibility for this De-identification and re-identification is at the project investigator. He's responsible for the pseudonymization of the participant in his project. But this is sometimes not done. Like many of you probably have ever received a research data set including names, phone numbers, addresses. And it is often done in very different ways. So some studies are doing it on Excel files, some on paper files, some in Access. So there are many different ways how to keep record of your participants. So there is an urgent need for a reliable interoperable solution, and that's why we come up with the IDEAL project. What is the advantage of the IDEAL project? So IDEAL project will provide an interoperable solution to ensure the linkage of pseudonymized research data with the identity of the data donor, so the subject. Thus, it will support the process of pseudonymization in any kind of research study which follows the Human Research Act. IDEAL will provide a very efficient and consistent solution for the process of re-identification of patients in research studies. So the project is split up in 3 parts. The ID mapping, this is the so-called record linkage feature. The electronic subject-specific study files, this is a feature for the pseudonymization of the patient. And in a 3rd step, we will have the National IDEAL Data Center. So I will now present these 3 aims step by step. So the first aim is this ID mapping. So what's the key problem? At the moment, we have the clinical data warehouse or any information in a hospital information system and the clinical research databases. But there is no option to link the 2 data sets. They are totally different or totally separate systems. So IDEAL is in the middle of the 2 databases of the 2 systems. So we will set up a database for the linkage. And we call it the IDEAL Linkage Database. This database includes the ID mapping or the so-called key ring. It's a very simple structure. So in blue, you see the information in the hospital, the identifiable information. For example, in the first row, we have Huber Peter. He has the patient identifier XZI and so on in the hospital. And on the right-hand side, you see in orange the study identifier. This study identifier is used by the research study. So in IDEAL, we combine the identifiable data and the pseudonymized data from the research study. So this data is very sensitive because you're not allowed to have identifiable information in the research database. And so we decided to do a decentralized structure. So every hospital has its local IDEAL linkage database. So patient identifiable data does never leave the hospital. This linkage database is set up in every single participating hospital. So how does the technical setup look like? So in orange, we see the application within the hospital. So we will install the local IDEAL application, which I will show you later on. This application is installed in every hospital, and information from the clinical data warehouse is imported in this local application, so with a daily extraction of patient information. We need also some exchangeable data. This is metadata, for example, which studies are registered in IDEAL, who is the study investigator, which study sites are participating. This data is metadata and stored outside the hospital on a national level. It will also be possible to exchange data with an API with the clinical research database, for example, with REDCap or Secure Trials. And what we also think about is doing a landing zone for lab values. For example, when you have the research study of the, for example, the Swiss Transplant Cohort study, via IDEAL, they can then ask for lab values from the hospital, which then can be automatically imported in the research database. So this is basically what we need for the project aim 1, the ID mapping. The second aim of the project is to generate log files. These log files are needed for monitoring reasons, for example, from Swiss medics. And we'll shortly explain how we try to do it. So it is somehow a process for pseudonymization of research data. So this is a real example of a sheet used at the University Hospital in Basel. So you see here the subject name in this example, it's Michael Koller, and you have some identifiable information here and also the subject number in the study. And you can imagine that it is very inefficient to re-identify and de-identify patient in such a way. That's why IDEAL will generate a generic interoperable tool to do this pseudonymization and also to generate these files, these paper files here, which also have to be signed by the principal investigator and the study monitor. So we will included in our application. So based on the IDEAL linkage database, which I've explained under aim 1, we will be able to generate these identification log files, which will include them like which participants were enrolled, were asked to participate in the studies, and so on. These files are needed for monitors, and they have to be GCP compliant. So I will now show you a demonstration of the IDEAL prototype so that you might better understand how our application will look like and present you some of the features. So when you log in as an IDEAL user, you have a list of patients participating in your studies. Like this user, for example, has access to 2 studies, the HTV study and the ITT study. And you see here a list of all the study participants. And when you want to add a participant to your study, you can click here, add a patient, and a list of all the patients in the clinical data warehouse are shown. So I will choose the first patient, column Tilma here, and choose the study. This participant is participating in the HTV study and give him a subject number. And you see now my patient is added here, and you see in the patient overview. So it's a very efficient way to add a patient to a study and also to link it with the clinical data warehouse. If a patient or participant is not available in the clinical data warehouse, you can still add a patient manually. And for larger studies, or many studies probably already have a list of patients, as the cohorts, for example, do. You can do a bulk import, so you can import a large data set of patients in IDEAL. I will shortly demonstrate it. You can import the CSV file with your participants. And then as you see, we have now imported 38 patients of this study, and 8 of the 38 patients were matched automatically. This means the identical names were found in the clinical data warehouse data. You see here the first 38 patients starting with A1 are imported. And now, for example, this Morillo Raquel was linked automatically, so we can look it up here. So this is the information from the clinical data warehouse. So we have phone number, address, and everything. And this was the information in the clinical research study. So there is a patient ID, a study ID, and some basic information. The linkage is done by name, like the matching of the name, and also similar or identical date of birth. But of course, when you do such an automatic linkage or a linkage, there are also problems coming up. When we look at this patient, for example, we see here the patient was not automatically linked. And the reason why it was not linked is because in the research data set, the name was Harris Camille, and the real name is Harris Camila. So in this case, we have to find the correct patient in the clinical data warehouse and link it manually, as I do it now. So I can confirm this linkage, and now the patient is linked. Linked here, you see it here with this icon. There are also other problems. For example, Angela Merkel was not linked because in the study database, the first name was Angela Merkel, which is obviously wrong. And but I can, the algorithm shows me the closest match, and I can choose here Angela Merkel in the system and link it manually. So these are the key features we implement for this ID mapping for aim number 1 that I've explained you. And then I would also like to shortly show you the export of the log files. These are the files needed for the monitors. The PI have to sign this file. You can export the subject identification log. It will, at the moment, it is generating a CSV file, and it will, we will then try to implement a solution to generate PDFs where a list of patient is generated. It does not look very nice at the moment, but here you will have a list of patients. So far, to the presentation of our prototype. So just to summarize, the key data in the local IDEAL application is data from the hospital, like first name, last name, address, date of birth, phone number, email address, then the patient identification number from the hospital, and the information whether a patient gave general informed consent or not. This is not the informed consent for the specific study, it's the general consent from the hospital, which you usually decide to sign when you enter the hospital as a patient. And then IDEAL also does record some administrative patient data from the research study, the study identifier, the date of the informed consent, the version of the informed consent, screening date, and the study identifier. So the third aim is to set up a national IDEAL data center. The National IDEAL Data Center will not will be set up in the second year of the project. So aim number 1 and 2 are done this year. And then as a next step, we set up the National IDEAL Data Center. So in the National IDEAL Data Center, metadata is stored and a minimal set of information about the patient. We try to be able to match patient in the National IDEAL Data Center in a privacy preserving manner. So what information is included? The IDEAL National Data Center will include a code for privacy preserving record linkage, but it does not include any identifiable information, for example, name, address, phone number, or anything. It's just a minimal set of information. And this codes for the privacy preserved record linkage are generated by an algorithm in a decentralized way at the local hospitals. So what's about this privacy preserving record linkage? So a code is generated based on personal information, for example, the name, the date of birth, address, whatever. We still have to define how we will generate this code. This code will be able to find similar patients. For example, when a patient is participating in a study at SCHÜF and in a study at the University Hospital Zurich, we should be able to identify it in the National IDEAL Data Center as the same individuum. There are many methods how to generate these privacy preserving record linkage codes, and we still have to consult some expert to do it. We have, for example, two examples, like one article, for example, here from Kurt Schmidlin is from Adrian Spörri's group at the ISPM in Bern. He's also part of the IDEAL consortium and will be able to help us to solve this problem. Or as another example, there is the Mainzel Liste. This is also an open source service which generates such codes based on patient identifiable file information. So this was the summary of our 3 project aims, but of course, IDEAL also has some boundaries. So just to make sure, IDEAL is only about interoperability of person identifiable data. It's not interoperability of health-related personal data. And it is also not a tool to create interoperability between clinical data warehouses. It's only about identifiable information. And it does also not include a national identifier for research. So this is what we probably all dream about, that every patient has an identifier and we can link it, or every participant has an identifier that we can link over all study, but this is not what IDEAL can provide. Here the legal basis is still missing. And what IDEAL probably also will include is a landing zone for clinical data warehouse data, for example, a solution to provide lab values for a specific study or something like that. But here we still have to clarify what is within IDEAL and what is not covered by IDEAL. There are some data governance considerations when we talk about IDEAL. So it is clear that the hospital is the data controller of the identifiable information. So the data must not be disclosed to any third party outside the hospital. So all identifiable information stays within the hospital. The project investigator of the study is a data controller, and he's responsible for the study data. And the researcher also outside the study can request data from IDEAL, of course, only when there is ethical approval. So one of the most important thing is that IDEAL is compliant with the legislation. So we have to follow the data protection law, and this is very important. So as I said, all identifiable information is stored within the healthcare provider's institution, and IDEAL also has approval by the legal department of the University Hospital Basel and the data protection officer from Basel Stadt. So we really try to have to follow all the legal rules, and also to have an interoperable tool which is broadly applicable. So we are also compliant with the GCP guidelines and the general data protection regulations. As we already mentioned, it's a pity that we're not allowed to use the social security number, the AHV number. It is not allowed to use it for research. This would be the perfect number also to identify duplicates and also to connect patients between different study centers. So one question came up whether a specific informed consent is needed to participate in IDEAL, and this is not the case. An informed consent is needed for a specific study, but not to include a patient in this local IDEAL linkage database, as I showed it. So how far are we with the project? So the project started in December 2020. We were able to write the project specification and descriptions. And as you saw, we've already started to develop the IDEAL prototype, but this is still in a very early stage. And here I would also like to thank Yiqing Su, who developed this prototype in a very efficient way. We did a local installation of this prototype at the University Hospital Basel and imported the real data from the clinical data warehouse. So only the University Hospital Basel has 1 million patients which were included in the IDEAL prototype. And there we also run a test with data from the clinic, from the Swiss Transplant Cohort study. So we imported the data from the Swiss Transplant Cohort study for the linkage, and we were able to automatically link 90% of the study participants in the Transplant Cohort study. So this just means that this prototype runs very smoothly in the University Hospital Basel, and also the linkage with the first research study we tried was very successful. And we are now rolling out to the other university hospital. There are still some agreements needed, some legal things to clarify, but we really hope that at end of year we have included all the university hospitals and also the Kantonsspital St. Gallen. And of course, we are investing a lot of time in communication and networking. So we really aim to have an application which can be used from different institutions and organizations, and it should be as interoperable as possible. So what challenges do we have to implement the project? So as I said, setting up this collaboration is difficult, and we are very glad to have support from SPHN and also the Swiss Institute of Bioinformatics to do so. We have to do exhaustive testing of the IDEAL prototype. We test it with different cohorts and also with clinical trials. And we also aim to implement the federated Swiss EduID login for the IDEAL users. So this was one requirement for the funding. So we're still working on that. And we aim to come up with a final software product as soon as possible. It should be, we should receive a GCP approval. And then it's also important to think about the longer run. So how will we maintain the National Ideal Data Center once the project is finished? So who is responsible? Where do we get the money from? And then, as I said, we will also invest a lot of time in setting up this National Ideal Data Center next year. Now in this first prototype, we focused on a minimal set of use cases, but in the longer run, we would also like to expand somehow the functionalities and the features of our application. And we think, for example, about involving all individuals or all subjects with a general consent given at the hospital. And we should also think about how involving participants outside the hospitals, like patients from private physicians, for example, or from population-based registry. So this is not clear yet. And we would also like to integrate a link to the Swiss biobanks. And there are many more use cases we think about, for example, how to elaborate the collaboration with the Swiss cancer registries and many more. We think IDEAL has a large potential. And one strength of IDEAL is this decentralized structure. So we will build up a network where many different healthcare providers are involved, not only hospital, also private physicians and many more. And I think this network can be used, or we can profit from this network in the future in different ways. And IDEAL will be strong when many hospital and institutions will participate. So the larger the network, the better and the more powerful the project or the infrastructure will be. So you can find more information on our website, and we are very happy to take questions. Thank you very much.